All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Knowledge Exchange webinar. My name is Karin Nilo. I'm NAMP's Program Associate. Now, just a couple of tips before we get started, just in case you haven't used the Zoom software before. So to start, you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Now, that's just to avoid any feedback or background noise. We would, of course, love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar. There are a couple ways that you can do that. If you mouse over the main window in Zoom at the bottom of your screen, you should see both a chat and a Q&A function. If at any point you have a question, you can type your question into the Q&A box or the chat function, and either of those will get the questions to us. There's no need for you to wait for us to pause to type those questions in as they come to you. When we do go ahead and pause for questions, we'll read out what you've sent along. So without any further ado, let's get started with today's Knowledge Exchange webinar. I'm happy to hand the presentation over to TRG Arts.
Thanks, Karin. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are TRG Arts. My name is Kate Hagen. I'm a senior consultant, and with me today is my colleague Corey Medler, who's Data Services Manager for TRG Arts Data Center. We're so pleased to have the opportunity today to share with you this webinar, which is called Audiences, Fact versus Fiction, Data-Informed Audience Development. As I was looking at the registration list, I saw some familiar names on the list from our work in the field. It was lovely to have you here. I want to start today by saying a thank you to NAMPT and to Karin for providing us with this opportunity. I also want to thank all of you for carving time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. As Karin mentioned, you can use that Q&A or chat function at any time to enter a question in about the webinar. Please make sure you include your name and organization so we know who we're talking to. And we'll aim to address as many of those questions as we can at the end of the webinar. If for some reason we wouldn't get to your question, or if you're like me and a processor and you think of your question at 3 a.m. Tomorrow night, feel free to email us at letstalk@trgarts.com and we'd be happy to follow up with you. This webinar will be recorded, so you'll be receiving an email following up after the webinar with a link to the recording sometime next week. So it will also be posted to the NAMPT website and to the TRG Arts website. So if something moves too fast or you want to go back and reference for your notes later, you'll have the opportunity to do so. And with that, we're gonna move forward here. Provided moves forward. First and foremost, just for those of you who might be new to TRG Arts or for whom it's been a while, we are a consulting firm that is dedicated to the arts and entertainment field. We use data to develop strategies that help our clients achieve results. Primarily focused on building working capital, financial capital for organizations, as well as loyal audience patronage. Really, if we were to sort of boil all of that down under one umbrella, it's strategic practices for long-term sustainability, not just immediate impact. This is just a handful of the clients that we've worked with over the years since we were founded by our late founder, Rick Lester, in 1995. As you can see, there's a broad range of genres here, as well as work in 4 countries now: the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK. And as we work with our clients, the place that we are always curious about with our clients is about the connection between programming and patronage and how the two can fuel each other. Since our founding over 22 years ago, we've worked with more than 1,000 clients on scalable projects for sustainable growth. Our team is now 42 members strong. Between our truly world headquarters in Colorado, we also have a permanent office in the United Kingdom. What I'd say is that of those team members, what is true about all of us is that we provide guidance and solutions that are patron-based, people-based, for sustainable loyalty of our patrons and sustainable revenue from those patrons. When we use the word patron, and you're going to hear it from us a lot in today's presentation, we're talking about any person who is engaged with an arts and entertainment organization. So it's natural for us to default to thinking single ticket buyers, subscribers, donors, members. But I also want you to consider, as you think about patrons, all the people who are engaged with your organization and where you might have relationships that could be managed. Think participants in education programming, volunteers, attendees of free or ancillary events. These are all patrons and potential supporters of your organization, and that's where we dig in with our clients to leverage that for long-term success. Heading into this discussion, which is really about audience building, all of you could answer this question, and I suspect there'd be a million different answers. I want my audience to look more something. As we work with organizations across the field, we hear lots of different responses. I want my audience to look younger. I want my audience to look more like the community in the 4 or 5 blocks around the theater. I want to draw people from our local area, not just the suburbs. I want to have an audience that looks like a room full of Super Bowl fans. Lots of different answers we might have to that. But the question we always ask in return is, great, that's a great goal. How are you going to know if you've been successful? If Corey and I walk into your theater a year from now and you've told us our audience is going to look more like people who love the color purple, how are we going to know? The right answer, it won't surprise you, is data. Data is the thing that helps us all answer that question without the biases that can come in as we all look at a theater audience and say, well, I think it looks more purple or less purple. We really want to have data to remove that sort of emotion from the equation. Today we're going to look at a case study of how we use data to really set the stage for audience building with a real world organization. And for those of you who've identified the picture, this is the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Guthrie, many of you may be familiar with them. They opened in 1963 and really became sort of the model for regional nonprofit theater across the United States. This building that you're seeing here in the photograph opened in June of 2006, and it houses 3 performance spaces. They have 2 main stage theaters. One is a classic thrust, the other is proscenium stage. And then on the top of the building, that sort of box that you see up there with all the windows, up there, there's a studio theater, black box style performance space. As they were wrapping up their 10th anniversary season in this new building, the Guthrie wanted to look at ways that they could expand the diversity of their audiences and really begin to engage proactively underserved members of their community. And that is the impetus behind the work that we're going to share today. There were really 3 questions that we had together with Guthrie as we started this project. One was, who are the audiences that we serve now? We know that broadly the board and the leadership at Guthrie had said, well, we want audiences to look more diverse than they do today. But to answer that question of what would more diverse be, we have to start by knowing who are the audiences that are coming now to set a baseline for that growth. And secondly, the question that we had was, what's the diversity look like in Guthrie Theater's community? Different people around the table had different perceptions of what the community's diversity or not in Minneapolis, Minnesota could look like. And so again, data can help us answer the question to understand what does our community look like and what are the opportunities for growth in our audience. And last but not least, of those diverse audiences that we do have, what are the current attendance trends? What can we learn from the programming and marketing efforts and the diverse audiences who are coming today, as we define those, that might help us begin to think about what we can do in the short term with marketing, but also what we might need to do in the long term as we think about programming for those audiences. We started with that. Let's understand who's coming now. Who are the people who are likely buyers or our audiences right now? And to do that, we studied 3 years of patron transactional behavior. So in this study, we not only looked at earned revenue, ticket sales, subscription sales, but also donor behaviors. And we took all of that transactional patron behavior and paired that with demographic data drawn from Axiom, which is a leading provider of consumer demographic data here in the United States. This is what we observed as we looked at the breakdown of the audiences Guthrie Theater serves today when we did this analysis. And what you can see is the majority of the audience, this was not a surprise to the Guthrie Theater, 93% of the audiences they were serving identified as Caucasian. Of the 7% who identified as some form of minority, pretty even split between Asian, Hispanic, and African American audiences. Within those different ethnic segments, we also looked at some of the other demography to understand if we were to sort of say, what does the profile look like of a typical audience member right now by ethnicity? What we observed was across the board, you know, for Caucasians and Asians, typically 40 or over was where the bulk of average patronage was. A little younger when we looked at African American and Hispanic audiences, 34 and over is where sort of the bulk of people were. Across the board, high school education consistently, at least a high school education or more. And then there were a wide range of average incomes. You can see those listed there on the right. And this is where one of the first decisions, as we sort of explored this and said, okay, what's the demographic of our audience today? And what do we want it to be in 5 or 10 years? How will we work around audience development to begin changing that picture? This was the first decision that we made with the Guthrie that said, right now we know what the average incomes are, but as we prospect for future audiences, we want to lower that target income range and say we want to target people who are making have average household incomes of $35,000 or more, even though we know today our typical buyer looks a little bit different than that. So this was the first decision point in looking at data that helped us identify something. And I would say to you, that was when we entered this work, no one was talking about economic or income range as a part of diversity. And so this is where looking at data can actually help us define what diversity means in audience building for an organization, perhaps even beyond the things that we walk in the room with that might be around age or ethnicity, as it was in the case of this client. We then wanted to look at the community around the Guthrie Theater to understand what is the community around us and what might our potential be. And we started again by looking at ethnicity. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, it is a majority Caucasian community, but 12% of the community were identifying as some form of minority. And you can see here, most of those folks were they're the Asian or African American demographic. Now remember, Guthrie's audience was 7% non-Caucasian. And so as we look at those numbers, one of the first things we identified together was to say, our audience is more heavily Caucasian than the population that lives around us. And so there is absolutely opportunity to bring our current audiences more in line, at the very least, with what our community looks like on average. As part of that work, we actually looked at, in the community, how many households are there within each of these ethnic groups, African American, Hispanic, and Asian, total, and of those, how many have we captured? So you can see there in the dark blue, those were the current audiences from those demographics that were attending Guthrie Theater or engaged with Guthrie Theater, and the light blue shows how many more potential households were sitting out there who could be engaged. We're going to look at African American, just a segment of, we delved into a lot of data for each of those demographics, but just as an example, I want to pull forward one from the African American audience example. I mentioned that we said, okay, we know which audience groups we have potential to go after. We've identified those. How could we leverage our current marketing and programming to think differently about targeting those audiences? And so we looked at the percentage of ticket buyers who were coming to each genre. Guthrie defined 7 different genres for the work that they had presented over the last 3 years in the study period. You can see those listed there along the bottom. The blue boxes represent the aggregate average. So of all single ticket buyers, what percentage of those ticket buyers fell into each of those genre buckets? And the green circles represent the percentage of the African American audience, African American ticket buyers. Where were they attending? And as you look at that, what you'll notice is there were two genres where African American audiences, the percentage of those audiences who were attending that genre was higher than the audience average overall. And that was in holiday performances. There was an annual holiday production and literary adaptation, which was a play that was based on a book. The other area that we observed strong participation was in musicals. Now, admittedly, it's slightly lower for African American audiences than the audience as a whole, 3 percentage points. But more than 1 out of 4 African American audience ticket buyers had come in through one of the 3 musicals. And so as we thought about, again, what this might tell us both about where we might direct our marketing efforts in the short term for seasons that had already been planned, and where we might sort of explore and do some surveying to think about what would future season planning want to look like. These were starting points where we could focus some attention. We also needed to put some numbers around this. So if what we were going to say was we want to grow African American audience attendance by 5% in the course of the next season, we need to start thinking about how we're going to invest around that. And we looked at if we were to invest in the full range of programming, meaning I'm going to market everything to everybody for African American audiences. So again, those households in our community who we can identify as African American audiences, we projected that we could anticipate if we grew the audience by 5%, generating roughly $5,800 in revenue. At our current marketing expenses for prospecting, it was going to cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,150. But if we focused those efforts and said, instead of trying to market the whole season, if we were just to focus on those 3 types of performance genres where we saw were most likely entry points for African American audiences, one, we could anticipate higher ticket revenue, in part because by focusing on the most likely areas, we can see both higher response rates to marketing efforts from those genres, and in part because those genres tend to have slightly higher ticket prices. We also saw reduced costs because, again, we're not trying to throw everything at them. We can focus in on a few key messages, which meant higher net revenue. And the goal of this sort of scenario work was really to say building audiences costs money, and we want to invest smartly against it. And we want to create net revenue from those audiences that lets us take those dollars and invest them back in continuing to grow those new audience demographics, creating capital that we can use to keep fueling the audience development that we want to see. The second thing that we looked at was audience retention rates. And this is a really important place to look. We often think about that first invitation. How can we get a new audience member in the door? What is true is that as we look nationwide and have studied audience behaviors, 2 out of every 3 ticket buyers in any given year are going to be a first-time ticket buyer. That means if you are normal, 2 out of every 3 people walking through your door on any given night to any given production are going to be there for the first time. What we also see as we look at patron behaviors across the field and from the many clients that we work with, roughly 75% of those first-time buyers are going to walk out the door at the end of that same evening, and we will never see them again. And so if we aren't planning not just for that first invitation to new audience members, but how we are going to ensure that we have a second and third engagement with them, I would argue that we aren't really planning for audience development. We're planning for a one-night stand, if you will. When we looked at the demographics and the retention rates by demography, what we saw was that for the overall audience, we were hanging on to about 1 in 3 ticket buyers. So of everybody who came, about 1 in 3 were coming back for a second performance in the following year. For African Americans specifically, we saw it was a little less than 1 in 3. It was actually 1 in 4. And so one of the pieces of this work was to say, as we think about marketing plans strategically, we need to not only think about inviting and prospecting for new households, but also how we're going to support the relationship after that first performance to make sure that we invite them back for a second date with us, if you will. That's what really leads to long-term growth in audience retention. So this was one of the second decisions that Guthrie made that was not part of their plan when they first contemplated what growing audiences would look like. It was really about how can we invest money not just in attracting people, but also fortify some retention touch points to ensure that we keep that relationship going. So key takeaways, what does this mean as if we were all to sit down and go back to our own shops and think about what would it look like to grow audiences? First and foremost, I would encourage you to identify who's in your current audience. What's your baseline for before you grow your audience? Where are you starting from? And secondly, understand your community. What audience development is going to look like in Minneapolis, Minnesota which is one community, is going to look different than it does in the Pacific Northwest, than it does in the Sun Belt, than it does here where I live in New York City. The communities around us are different. Even within a couple blocks in New York City, you might have very different communities around you. And so understanding who is around you and who are the right people for your organization to invite to the party is important. And then last but not least, you've got to have data-based objectives and plans to achieve change. Who are the people that we're going to target? How specifically using data will we know that we've been successful in moving the needle on creating new and diverse audiences and over time? As we work with our clients, we use some tools through TRG Arts Data Center to help our clients build and execute on campaigns that are targeted in the ways I've described. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Corey, who's going to talk through the tools that we use and how you might use tools like these in your organization.
Thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. And my name is Corey Medler. Reminder, I'm the Data Services Manager here at TRG Arts, and part of my role is managing all of our data center clients and our community networks. As we think about data center, and as Kate mentioned, the first step in expanding or building audiences is identifying and understanding who your current audience is. And TRG Arts Data Center is one tool that can help you discover this. Some of you may already be familiar with this tool. I see, again, some familiar faces. But for those of you who aren't, Data Center is a cloud-based software service for arts and cultural organizations that allows you to perform demographic and buying habit research about your patrons. It supports building targeted marketing campaigns through its segmentation tools and filtering functionality. And it also aids in your prospecting and acquisition efforts via a secure permission-based list trading platform. And I'll see if I can get these slides to advance. I might need your help here, Kate. There we go. So when two or more organizations in a community have data center licenses, they create a TRG community network. And these community networks offer a combined pool of potential patrons to not only trade for acquisition, but also to provide valuable analytics and insights for your arts community, which allows you to perform your own patron research on inside of your own organization, as well as patron research on the entire community data set that participates, essentially providing a top-line snapshot of your local arts community. You can then use this community data set to compare to your own organization's data set to better understand your market potential. This is just a snapshot. It's not a full market analysis because it is dependent on participation. But we currently operate 25 community networks across the United States with more than 560 arts organizations participating to create a national data set of about 33 million arts households. And you can see the breakdown of some of those in some of our top markets there. So how does this work? How does data center work? As we all know, there are many ticketing systems and CRMs in use across our industry, and data center works by taking in patron data from any of those unique systems and standardizes it for aggregate and individual use. So as your patron data comes into data center, it is normalized and hygiened through national change of address. It is standardized with segmentation schemes and converted to anonymized cookies for digital advertising. And then very excitingly, it is appended with demographic and psychographic attributes, allowing you to research your own patrons as well as that community data set. As Kate mentioned, Axiom is our provider for these consumer demographics, and there are more than 200 demographic and psychographic attributes that are appended on a weekly basis. So you are regularly receiving this updated data. Furthermore, this aggregate data is available for you to perform unlimited research through reports and list filtering. So as you upload your data after each performance or show, it is automatically appended with these demographics, allowing you to perform that patron research as often as needed. So today, let's take a quick look at these reporting features that can support your research and analysis. Data Center has over 20 business intelligence reports that are unlimited and included in an annual license, but today we're just going to focus on the demographic report. This report can be ran on your entire community's data set if applicable. It can be ran just on your own organization's data set or on any group of patrons you want to research, such as just your single ticket buyers. The report includes the entire line level detail of all 200 plus demographic attributes, as well as visuals so that the information is easily digestible. And today we're just going to look at a few of these visuals to give you a quick idea of what's available. So in our example today, you'll see that we're looking at the entire Raleigh community data set, which has an overall match rate of 65%. We typically see a match rate between 60 to 70%, so this is within our expected standard. And in this visual, we are looking at the income of Raleigh's arts patrons. And we can easily see that there's a large increase starting at the 65,000 marker and another large decrease starting at the 150,000 marker, giving us just a quick snapshot of the community patrons. Another visual is the age of your patrons in 2-year increments. Again, this is for the community data set. And this quick visual is provided so you can easily see the distribution of your patrons. Here we see a steady increase through the 20s and 30s with a peak around 48 and then a plateau in the 54 to 70 ages. And as a final visual, we have generations and ethnicity broken out. Again, just quickly digestible so that you can see that the majority of you can understand the majority of your patrons and where they fall within these attributes. So here we see that Raleigh's audience is primarily Generation X and baby boomers, and not surprisingly, 91% identify as Caucasian. So this demographic report, these are just examples of visuals that come automatically with this report, but it allows you to perform a quick profile of your patrons so that you have data informing your decisions. And because you can run these reports on your own data as well as on the community data, it also allows you to see where there are gaps and opportunities in your audiences so that you know exactly where to focus those engagement goals. Perhaps your audience makeup, and this is similar to what Kate was speaking about with Guthrie, but perhaps your own audience makeup is only 6% Hispanic, but the community data set is larger at 20%. And so this shows you that there is some potential there, and now you can know exactly who to invite to the party to move the needle. So once you have this top level market profile of your current patrons, you can then use Data Center to filter your patrons to find those that meet the desired criteria. If you recall, Data Center is also a segmentation tool that allows you to build targeted lists for your campaigns. And you can, of course, do this by how you segment your data, but you can also use Data Center to apply filters to your lists to refine them even further. So once you understand who your audience is, you can create a list in Data Center that identifies those exact groups by adding the demographic filters. For example, you can create a list in Data Center that includes, let's say, the last 3 years of your single ticket buyers, and then add demographic filters to that list to find only those patrons who are African American and have a household income of $40,000 or more. You can find those patrons who are millennials with children present in the home. And you can also refine to find specific children ages too, if you're promoting a teen program or an early childhood education program. You can also find the patrons who have a net worth of more than $500,000 and have expressed an interest in art. And these are just a few examples of how you can use those demographic filters inside of Data Center to build those targeted lists. However, you can also apply geographic filters that can further refine for you, allowing you to target very specific zip codes or neighborhoods, perhaps those that are within close proximity to your own organization, or you can further expand your reach and go outside into either underserved neighborhoods or those neighborhoods that you're looking to target. So here is just a quick snapshot of what that looks like inside of Data Center. Some of you, again, may be familiar with this, but those of you who aren't, you would first build a list in campaigns, and then you can use the demographics link to add any filters that you would like to. And you can see here and highlighted in yellow that I've added the income and race filters. So an income of $35,000 or more, and then our race is African American. And once these filters are added, your net count will automatically recalculate to show you the filtered and deduped amount of patrons that meet this criteria so that you can contact only them. You will notice that there's a small list fee of $25 for this, and this is only applicable when you finish and close a list with filters applied, but you have unlimited access to the aggregate data to add as many filters as you want and run as many reports as you want for research. So if we go back to the best practices that Kate covered here, Data Center provides these necessary data points at your fingertips so that you are making those data-driven decisions to identify your own audience and your local market so that you can set goals for growth and achieve that change. It supports your targeted marketing strategy, allowing you to perform ongoing, regular demographic analysis of your patrons and allowing you to reach the right person with the right offer. Data Center is the industry's only software service that provides access to community data sets for aggregate research, as well as permission-based list trading between arts organizations. And it is just one of many tools that can help you make these data-driven decisions that support your own organization's strategies. So with that, let me turn it back over to Kate. Is there anything else you'd like to add there, Kate?
I think I'd simply say this is a great time for us to take questions. I'm sure there are some there in the pool. So Corey and Karen, I know you've been monitoring the chat and the Q&A, and so I wonder if we've got some questions there.
We did have a few questions come up in the Q&A, Kate, that really popped up when you were talking about identifying the audiences. And so they're more specific to how you reach those demographics.
Sure. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those.
Okay, let me, I'll start and I'll read off the first question from Tanisha. She says, I'm curious if the minority audience is being targeted by discounts. I know that is a typical strategy we use when trying to encourage the diverse buyer.
Yeah, you know, it really depends on the overarching strategies that are inherent to the productions that you're marketing. What I'd say is, regardless of whether you're targeting a diverse community, anytime you're targeting non-buyers, people who are not currently, or a prospect list of some kind. In the case of Guthrie, we were actually going out and building prospect lists of people who were not currently buyers, but who fit the profiles we were looking for. The marketing was a mix. So sometimes the offer was a discount, but sometimes the offer was added incentive. Sometimes the offer was really about time and urgency and proximity to a program that was quite popular, like the holiday shows. So I would say it's the offer is less important than creating an overarching strategy with multiple approaches in it, that is thoughtful about what the timing is, what the goals of the production programming are, and multi-layered in that way. So yes, and I think is the short version of the response.
And another question then from, well, actually it's an anonymous question, but so when thinking specifically about the African American audiences, did you think about those audiences with lower incomes paying more for musicals or those holiday shows?
It was a broad range, again, because while we were broadening the income levels we were targeting, there was still a broad spectrum of income levels across the community that we were targeting. And so again, it's a multi-layered approach, and sometimes multi-pronged approach depending on who we're talking to and what we're talking about. And when I say, average cost is more, we can be talking about differences of $1 or $2 in average price per ticket. But when you start talking about lots of buyers, that can make a big difference. So more doesn't necessarily mean a lot more.
Are there any follow-up questions to those answers? Do you guys feel like that answered, got at the gist of what you were asking? And here we get a follow-up. Thank you, Tanisha.
Great.
So Kate, Tanisha says, following up, barring the discounts and pay disparity, why do you think there is such a spread in the economics of those two audiences? You'd think that demographically, minorities of similar economics would have more in common in terms of buying habits.
Mm-hmm. Nisha, I'm not sure I fully understand your question. So if I think what you're asking is what we saw there were that some of as we looked at the demography of who was currently attending at the Guthrie Theater, that the average household incomes for African American audiences were lower than those of Hispanic and Asian audiences, which were lower again than Caucasian audiences. I suspect, going back to that study, there were, while those were the averages, there were highs and lows across all of those audiences. And what's true as we looked at the community as a whole, there were some differences in average income by ethnicity for the Minneapolis community as a whole. And, in that particular community, African American and Hispanic households had lower average incomes than Asian and Caucasian households. That's not uncommon, I would say, in the United States. Many communities look like that. And so we weren't necessarily surprised to see differences when we looked at those who were engaged. I think it was also something that we were curious about. And again, as we think about subsequent work beyond just the data, having some practical, think qualitative study to be able to talk to those different audience groups that Guthrie was targeting, to talk to people from those audience groups who were attending to understand more about why there might be some differences there. I think there was more research needed, is my point, to say getting at the root causes sometimes means we have to go beyond the data and start asking questions and talking to people in person to get real answers there. It's a great question, Tanisha. And gosh, we could talk about economic diversity all day. I suspect we could probably have 12 webinars on that, right?
Yes. Great. We had another one come in while you were. Oh, sorry. Tanisha is sending out another question. But she's just confirming that, yes, you understand, and she followed your answer. So disregard that one. But we do have another one from Nick who asks, how do you get stakeholders to learn from the data after presented to change programming so that there is something to offer underserved markets beyond targeting for existing programming?
Yeah, I think that comes back to an institutional commitment. You know, diversity, audience building, let's take it out of the sphere of diversity for a moment. Audience building in general, we often turn and all sit and look at the marketing director and go, well, what are you doing to build out diverse audiences or build new audiences or build any kind of audiences? And while yes, marketing is one of the places that audience building happens, at the end of the day, we across the organization are responsible for that. Because quite frankly, the stories that we're telling on stage, the types of conversations that we're having with our audiences at the box office, the kinds of conversations that we're having with our grantees and funders, those are all part of the footprint and the relationship that we have with the community. And so the thing that I would say, even before we get to the finger pointing of, is it marketing, is it artistic, who's responsible? At the end of the day, we're all responsible. And so starting from a place, and that was part of this work actually, was starting from a place where everybody in the leadership of the organization and the board could sit down and say, okay, these are the things that we're committing to. When we say diverse audiences at Guthrie Theater, this is what we mean specifically. This is why we mean it. And we are all committed and rowing the boat in the same direction around what that will look like, was a key part of taking time to look at this data and really agree on that together. That's a long conversation. So in Guthrie's case, that didn't mean we could completely change the entire season that had already been planned ahead of them. That season was sort of in place. And so part of the goal of this work was to say, okay, with the season that's immediately before us, what can we do in the here and now? And then what do we need to start thinking about, and what would guide us as we think about both the things we know from attendance that would guide programming, but also things that we'd want to be asking in surveys and qualitative studies to understand what kinds of programming are these audiences that we are committed to building interested in? What do they want to come to help us craft seasons that help us achieve the objectives that we have together, the shared objectives we have together. The other thing I'd say, just as an add-on to that, the other thing data can help you with is setting realistic goals that say, if this is the season we have, this is what growth is going to look like, so that there's shared expectation around, if you've got a season that is all, was all Shakespeare work for some reason, here's what we expect growth to look like in a way that might be different if it was a season of, literary adaptations in this case.
Thanks, Kate. We will take a quick shift now because we have a question coming in that is more about data center and how it works. So the question is, what is the entry point for customer opt-in for data that is shared in TRG Data Center? And that's a great question around the process of that, especially as we think about data privacy in today's world. There are terms of use in privacy agreement policies that are written into the license with Data Center, and so the organization themselves would have to make sure that those align with your own policies around that, and then share and then agree to sign and join and add your data. That being said, as you join Data Center and upload your data, you have full control over it to make data visible or not visible for others to use. So if it's your organization's policy that you don't share data, then you can simply mark that as invisible and unshareable, and it'll never be accessed by the other participating organizations. But it is really more at the organizational level rather than that patron level. There is another quick question around the demographics inside of Data Center that asks, can I get this demographic information on other organizations' data? which is another great question. And the demographic data is available for your own individual organization or your own lists that you build with your own data. So, isolating your single ticket buyers or your subscribers or your donors to do the demographic research there. You can't necessarily run a demographic report on, the North Carolina Theater if you are the North Carolina Opera. As an example, you can run it for all of the participating organizations, which is that community data set, but you can't pick and choose what organization that is not your own that you would like to run that demographic report on.
I would add to that, certainly it doesn't preclude, and certainly we've had organizations who partner with each other to say, this is maybe a crude analogy, but I'll show you mine if you show me yours. So you can certainly partner with other organizations if there are places where you want to see if there's alignment and opportunities for shared endeavors in that way.
There is also, Kate, you actually bring up another good point, that when you build a list inside of Data Center, if you're including trades in that list, you can run the listed demographic report for that trade data. So there is a way to get at some of it, but just maybe not the entire organization's demographic profile.
And you can understand, of course, if you as an organization would want to be giving permission before we were to show your entire demography to everyone else in the community. So it's meant to maintain organizational privacy. That's the
correct.
Concept.
Yeah, and it's secure, permission-based, and is highly written into the terms of use and privacy agreement. Kate, we have another question that popped up that will go to you. So this question is the program categories you analyzed at Guthrie were specific to diversity. Those comedy, drama, holidays, etc. Was that purposeful, and why did you take that approach?
Sure. Again, Guthrie was really at the beginning of this work. The programming had never taken on an angle that was designed to create diversity. And so the program buckets, as we defined that, as we sat down with Guthrie and defined what they wanted to be at their organization, were based on the genre of plays that were being presented, not on being able to say, this play was designed to attract this, people who love the color purple, which is a play and or musical, and so not a great example. People who love the color blue. Certainly we have done that work, I would say, with other organizations that have values-based or specific programming designed to target very specific audience groupings. So absolutely you could do similar analysis with those groupings if that was a way you have been programming. In Guthrie's case, they were programming as a normal theater might, around having a mixture of different genres in every season. And so we wanted to look at within that sort of how Guthrie had been programming, what were the audience attendance trends we were observing. I would also say there weren't any productions where within musicals, for example, that, clearly everybody was an African-American ticket buyer bought that musical. It was an across-the-board trend that we saw regardless of the musical title. So I would also say, in that work, it wasn't blind to what the titles were underneath those programs. We always check that because we're curious nerds when it comes to things like that. So we're thoughtful about it too as we look at the data and what the data says.
Another quick question. I think coming from a more curious perspective, why are we not seeing minority households of means coming to the theater?
Well, I would turn back and say, do we have data that says that that's true? Again, in this case, while the averages were different across the board, there were minority households of means and minority households not of means, just as there were Caucasian households of means and Caucasian households not of means in the study. So, I would first go back and say there's an assumption even in that question that says minority households of means don't buy tickets to arts organizations. I would want to look at data that really says, is that true? Is that true? And secondly, I would go back to community analysis. So again, every community is different, but there are, as we look proportionally at within specific demographics you identify, and these could be both ethnic ones, but certainly age ones as well, within that age or within that demographic across the entire community. So if you were to look at your entire metro area, and census data is available to all of us, so you could certainly pull that up. What are the ranges of incomes and wealth in your region, and what does that look like by ethnicity? And are there differences that might help explain why incomes might look different at your arts organization than or within your data set across those different ethnicities? That would be one of the first questions I'd ask as I was looking at that. So one, check it with data. Is that, is that assumption that we're making even within the question true? It might be, but let's know it's true. And then secondly, let's look at our community and understand, is that a function of the community we're in? Is it true within our community that there are differences in the volume of households with means when we look at ethnicity that might be driving some of those trends that we observe? And if that's true, one, how might that tell us we need to behave differently as audience builders? And as people who are telling stories, and hopefully as arts organizations who take responsibility for our community, are there things that it would be right for us to do around that? Would be another question I'd ask. And again, those are big questions that really take a lot of soul searching and leadership to really think through. So would not expect you to get that answered in a day. Those are, but they're the right questions to ask.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, the right place to start is by digging into that data.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we maybe have time for one more question, Kate.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question comes from Nick, and and he asks, does data exist that speaks to production value / expenses as it correlates to audience demographics?
Nick, I'm gonna say what I think your question is asking me, and I'm gonna respond to that. And if it's not, you're gonna follow up with us later, so we make sure we get it answered. What I think that you're asking, Nick, is is there data that says there are specific productions that are better for audience building, like specific titles or value, specific titles that correlate with audience building growth or success? I would say no, we don't have data that says, just program this show and you will solve all of your millennial audience building problems. If that's the question, no, we don't have data that suggests there's one magic title that no matter where it goes, it's definitely going to change the complexion or the age of your audience. If the question is to say, are there best practices around investment behind audience building, and so what is it going to take from a marketing cost perspective to change the profile of your audience? What I'd say is for single ticket sales, and this is regardless of whether you're doing special audience building or not, we recommend in general that organizations be spending 20 to 35% cost of sale, meaning 20 to 35 cents on the dollar against what you're planning to earn. Audience building, anytime you're marketing towards new audiences, is going to be on the more expensive end of that spectrum. I would say you should be spending or anticipating you're going to spend on the 35% end of that spectrum based on what you expect to earn, because in fact it's inviting new people that you don't know to come is much harder than bringing back, and more expensive than bringing back audiences that you already know. I would also say, you know, and many of the people who've been pioneering in this field around audience building would agree with it. If you think that audience building means it's all grassroots and free, community effort is going to get you to growth. You're not planning to be successful. So, Nick, I hope one of those answered your question. And if not, email us at letstalk@trgarts.com, and we'll circle back with you and make sure we get you what you need.
He did actually ask one clarifying point, Kate, if you have time, which is what about black box versus full scale production in that same context?
Yeah. In fact, that's a great question, Nick. That was one of the assumptions. In fact, people said, just plan stuff in the black box, then people will come to it. In fact, we saw that the audiences who were coming were not coming strictly to the black box. In fact, most of them were coming into the main stage productions, just as most of the regular audience, the audience overall was coming to main stage productions. So there's not a correlation between just put it in the space and the audiences will magically be attracted to it in ways that they weren't before. It truly is more about, is more multi-layered than that. There isn't a magic lever you can pull by putting it in a specific style of theater or by just planning a specific title that is going to get you 100% of the way there. It is those things, and the way you market it, the way that you build relationships with that audience demographic, and the ways that you do the day in, day out work that create meaningful change.
There was one other note that I would actually just like to say live here for everyone, because somebody asked if the presentation will be available to colleagues who are not available to join today. Yes, the webinar will be posted on the NAMT website, and any logged in NAMT member will be able to view the video. So know that and share with your colleagues if they weren't able to join us today.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of all of your time. I know we're all busy people. So with that in mind, what I'd say, folks, is thank you for your time today. Please, yeah, absolutely look for that recording and go ahead and share that with colleagues. And again, if you're like me and you're a processor of things and you keep thinking about it, and next week you've got a follow-up question, please reach out to us, letstalk@trgarts.com. And we'd be happy to continue the conversation with you. And may you all, as you continue developing your audiences, may you all be using data in that process, and may you be successful, and may you be successful. Thank you all. Happy Wednesday. Karin, I'm handing it back to you in case there's any last things you need to say before we all sign off here.
Great. Thank you both so much for the fabulous presentation. As I said, everything will be on the NAMT website later this week, so definitely be sure to come back to look at the webinar, or tell your colleagues to take a look at it as well. Other than that, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next Knowledge Exchange webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.